everyone. How you doing? Welcome to another Putting Out the Fires online teaching and learning series here. We are in a learning pathway, and hopefully if you're watching the video, you recognize this gentleman's face because he does have a little bit, I'm going to say a little bit sarcastically, history in Iowa. And we're here today, again, just to provide you some insights, some new ways of thinking, some pushing and nudging in the right way with the right context as we're all trying to just figure out education. We're in a disruption, and I know we keep referencing pandemic, but at some point, we're going to move into life that's post-pandemic, but we're still going to have these situations of face-to-face, hybrid, online, and just the general nuances of education always looking different. So we're here today with a phenomenal guest, someone I hold in such high regard, a great friend, and every time I get a chance to speak with him, I feel like I always walk away a little smarter and challenged in a great way. So Scott, I'm going to let you introduce yourself for those that don't know who you are to set the stage here, and then we'll dive into the conversation.
Thanks for the kindness, Aaron. Hi, everybody. My name is Scott McLeod. I'm an associate professor of educational leadership at the University of Colorado, Denver. I used to be in Iowa, ran the educational administration program at Iowa State, was one of the leaders in the statewide grassroots one-to-one movement, where we went from 6 one-to-one districts to 220 in about 6 years. It started EdCamp Iowa, started the Iowa One-to-One Institute as a counterpart to the ITech conference, 6 months separate, and so on. And I've just been boots on the ground in like 140 Iowa school districts trying to make the work happen, which is how I know Aaron. I'm also, have worked with most of the AEAs, SAI, and so on. So lots of organizations within the state, and I'm very active online. You can follow me at Dangerously Irrelevant or on Twitter or in a number of other places you can sort of find the work that I do. And as you can see, I'm casual today, as Aaron and I just kind of hang out and chat about whatever he wants to talk about. So here we go.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so quite the long list, and for just like every session we've talked with, this is another just really important, powerful person to have in your learning networks as we're all trying to work on these things together. And I think for a lot of us, we're realizing now, maybe more than ever before, how important it is to strengthen our networks. For a lot of time, people have been doing that, some maybe not so much, and I think we're now really starting to see a need. So Scott is definitely one to throw into your circle because there's lots of great content and new ideas always coming through all the time. So it's always a great voice and perspective to have. But Scott, why we have you here, you know, I know you and Julie Graber, another person here in Iowa, you know, at one of our AEAs, recently published a book, and not that there's going to be a whole book talk, because I know you have a phenomenal book series on this very topic, which will be linked as a resource. But your book was Harnessing Technology for Deeper Learning, and what perfect timing, you know, unfortunately, that this book really kind of fits into the fold. And really where I want to take this is, one, I want to make sure people are aware of the book, but two, what are you seeing in the landscape? And I know you work with, not just in Colorado, but, you know, a lot of people reach out to you. You get to see a lot of different perspectives and ways that people are trying to figure this out. But what are you finding that people are doing that are finding maybe some success? I know that's super broad topic. I mean, that's not very specific, but just to kind of start there of, here we are, we're 4 to 6 weeks in here in Iowa at the time of this recording. So we're not into a stage of like, let's think about what to do. We are now going, we're in it, and we need help. And by we, I mean everyone in education, and that would, I think, even extend that to parents and community and stuff. Maybe what are some questions people should think about? What are some things that you've seen maybe as an example? And that might be the catalyst to dive deeper into some of your other ideas, because I think people right now are just going, help me. Please help me. And I'm not even sure they even know what question to ask, because it's a big burden right now.
Right. So thanks, Aaron, for mentioning the book. Julie and I wrote Harnessing Technology for Deeper Learning to try and help educators and school systems think about how do we integrate richer, higher level thinking, more real world authentic work, and high levels of student agency into our technology infused pedagogy. And we reference the 4 shifts protocol, which is meant to be a very practical tool for educators to do that. The 4 shifts protocol itself is free, so you don't have to buy the book to get access to that. Just search for it in Google, it'll pop up, and hopefully that's useful to all of you. I think what we're seeing, and I spent the summer working with educators in Virginia and Texas and Massachusetts, actually. And we spent a lot of time sort of working on instructional design and thinking about this fall. Is that you first have to get past the equity and the access issue, right? Like it's hard to talk about online and remote teaching if some significant number of your students don't have access at home with a device and some decent internet bandwidth. A lot that we can do about that other than for your local community to try and figure out how to get access for those kids. So I'm going to just sort of assume that that's a baseline that you have. I was been pretty good with device access, for instance, and hopefully you're solving some of the home internet issues. And I think what I'm finding, what we're all finding, right, is that we can't just continue to push out worksheet and homework packet like stuff to kids and think they're going to be engaged. Nor can we just fire up, you know, the webcam and lecture our kids for 80 minutes each day or whatever your time block is and expect them to stay engaged. In other words, the same kind of instructional variety that we need in our face-to-face classrooms, we also need in our online or blended classrooms. And so for many teachers who aren't necessarily very familiar with some of these remote technologies and blended possibilities, that's a tough call, right? What we saw in the spring was that as we went into sort of emergency shutdown mode, is that mostly what we did was sort of lower level factual recall and procedural regurgitation. And that might have taken the form of digital worksheets rather than paper homework packets. But bottom line is, that was all that we could muster in the spring. And the challenge for us is this fall is that we can't do another, semester or year of that. We're already losing kids left and right. We lost them in the spring. We're losing more of them this fall. Kids are just disappearing, who knows where they're going into the landscape.
Right.
And they're just kind of going dark on us. And if we're going to keep these kids engaged, we have to design for high engagement in online teaching like we would in face-to-face. So with that basic premise, I think we'll also articulate the main challenge, of course, which is that we don't have the same kind of connective tissue between human beings that we have when we're in a classroom face-to-face, right? So it's a bigger challenge for us to establish those learning communities and those relationships when everybody is scattered in their homes online via the camera. But that's the essential work, and it's probably the most important work that we should be doing right now, even more so than, say, content coverage, right? So
Yeah.
let's pause there. And
Yeah. No, I think it's good because I think you hit on a key point, and I go back and forth on this. Like, I don't know what comes first, the chicken or the egg type premise. And I know right now with the schools I support and the teachers that I'm working with, whether it's through this PD or just other general questions, the big struggle right now tends to be, this type of scenario, and it's phrased 20 different ways. One, they're not coming on to any of the calls whatsoever if they're 100% online, if a family has chosen that, or if it's the hybrid and they need to come in and do whatever the live learning looks like. And it looks different for every single building, but the kids aren't coming on. Or number two, they're on, but their video's not on, the audio's not on, and they don't ever engage in the material, And then number three, we obviously have just the turning in of assignments, and that's always been a conundrum, whether face-to-face. And, I call it the chicken or the egg because some of it can be, are you creating the content where they're engaged, but at the same time, how do you even get them engaged if they don't even begin step one? And so as we think about that, Scott, what are some, maybe I'm going to say ideas or questions or stuff for teachers to think about? Because here's what I see teachers, and I know you can relate to this. They're working tirelessly. They're putting more hours in than ever before. They're not attaining the level, I'm going to call it, of success that they're used to maybe in face-to-face, regardless of what their teaching practices were like. And they're just starting to get to that point of like, what else do I do? And I don't know that there aren't perfect answers out there in this. This is new territory to some degree. This is new territory for their coaches. It's new territories for their admin. It's new territory for their support. Um, what are your thoughts on that? I don't want to say give strategies or tips because that's,
Yeah.
there may not be anything concrete, but where are you? Because I feel like that is the real crux. And if we can calm some of that down, I really think then educators can have a little bit more energy or time to maybe dive into some of these other things that they really want to. But right now it's they're pressed. I got to turn in this data. I got to turn in these grades, but the kids never attended anything. So what am I to do?
Yeah. So, Aaron, I jotted down some notes real quick, and you articulated sort of three challenges. One is the kids who don't show up at all, right? And I think teachers can be part of that response team, but that should be administrators, counselors, school support staff. We need to be making home visits, with masks, safely distanced, and all the things, right? We need to track down these families and these kids and just say, like, like what's going on? Like, we don't really know what's going on in the home situation where these kids who would have shown up to school are now not showing up at all.
Yeah.
That's mostly beyond the teacher purview, unless a school decides that maybe teachers, because of their relationships with kids, are a good sort of first outreach to hopefully get some kids to respond there. I think the second issue around which you articulated, which is kids have their mics off, they have their cameras off, and so on, is that we don't really know what's happening at kids' homes, right?
Yeah.
And for every sort of white middle class family supportive situation like we have at my house, right, with my high school junior, we have other homes which might have multiple family members. It might be fairly chaotic there. We don't know if students are muting the mic because there's noise pollution in the background that they don't want to filter into the class. We don't know if a student is necessarily embarrassed by their home situation, doesn't want to show that to everybody. And so I think this idea of microphone and camera optional is a great idea,
Yep.
because it allows students to make the choice in any given day what seems to be best for them in what may be a very challenging home situation. And I think we have to remember that we are guests in students' homes virtually, and we can't just impose some of these control measures that we might otherwise try to make happen in school. Um, which brings us to the third one, which is that, I'm much less worried about a kid who's got their mic and camera off if they're doing some work and participating
Right.
than the one who isn't, right? And in terms of the assignments, I think it goes back to this idea that, we have to unpack why aren't kids turning in assignments? Is it because they're struggling for device access and time, right, with other members of the family? Is it because they were confused and don't know how to outreach to the teacher for help? Is it because they don't find the assignments meaningful and relevant, right? But now they have more agency over that decision making at home than they did in school, and so they can decide not to do it in a different way than they could if they were in your classroom, and so on. And so, it's hard to know what's going on with the assignments without unpacking a little bit what the student motivation or experiences there. You said, what else can we do as educators when we're already, working harder than we ever have worked before? And I think the answer is actually not to do something else, but to do something less.
Mm.
I think we have to give ourselves the grace of recognizing the time period we're in and the context that we're in. And, if we burn out by the end of October, that's not going to help anybody, right? So we have to somehow figure out how to exercise self-care, how to take care of ourselves and our families and our other loved ones. And yes, our students are that dynamic, but ultimately, right, the school year is a long slog, and we can't just flame out here in the next few weeks because we're trying to do everything that we did face to face and more. It's just not sustainable, right? And it's just not healthy for anyone. And so I think the answer is to do less. And I think there's a couple different ways to do that. One is to really take a hard look at your curriculum and say, what are the absolutely essential things that have to occur here? And to focus on those primarily, right? So I was talking about the high school principal in California, and she said there's the stuff that kids just absolutely have to get out of this class. There's the second bucket, which is sort of, the stuff that would be really great for them to know and could be interesting to explore. And then there's the third bucket of stuff, which is stuff that somebody says, it's like the margin material in the curriculum, the
Right.
stuff that, is sort of lower level or less important. And she said, dump bucket 3 completely, right? Which might be as much as a third or half of your curriculum, right? Figure out what make sure you do what's in the first bucket, and then the second bucket, that's where you're negotiating, which pieces of that do we want to really make sure happen and which ones we might have to let go. And then by doing less, that actually lets you go deeper, right? And lets you focus on conceptual understanding. It lets you focus on meaning making and sense making with kids, rather than sort of this relentless content coverage march. And so what that also does, it also frees up space for the teacher to do less, right? Like as a teacher, you probably should not be spending, 16, 18-hour days making lesson plans and figuring out direct instruction for your kids. You need to figure out ways to hand things over to your students. That might be an inquiry project, that might be a passion project, that might be some group work, that might be some kind of other interesting research investigation, anything that sort of offloads the ownership of the learning work from the teacher to the student is going to be helpful right now, right? So figure out how to create some longer, structured inquiry and meaning making experiences for students where they are driving the work. And that allows the teacher to then free up their time rather than saying, oh my God, I got to make all these things right by tomorrow. And it takes twice as long because it's remote, because that's the recipe for burnout. And to figure out how to tap into students as partners in that design experience rather than having to do all of that yourself, educator. So
Yeah.
those are some thoughts.
So I know some of that's, when we get down to the crux of it is I'm going to call it universal teaching practices that we know work, whether we're talking online or face to face. I feel like a lot of people still have the online. I'm going to group online and hybrid together just for this sake, but I know that there are differences. As this like one sphere, and then there's like the face to face. And I think for where a lot of the pressure that educators are feeling is, it feels like two separate jobs. It feels like I've got my face to face lesson planning and instruction and classroom management, and then I have this online world, whether that's through the hybrid approach or fully online, and they don't mesh. They don't play well. And so they, what would be one lesson, now everything's becoming two lessons. And I know I can sit here and be like, they should be one and the same, but it doesn't always click in the brain of people where this is a lot of new stuff. Yeah, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, and so I have a thought on that because I
Okay.
think they should be one and the same, because otherwise we're asking teachers to do double work.
Yeah.
And so and the answer here is to design for everything online, right? So even if you have kids face to face, the bottom line is you have some kids who are remote, right? And so unless you want to yourself by saying, I'm going to design this in-person learning experience here and this online learning experience here, right? And trying to design for both, basically just design everything for online. And then when you're lucky enough to have kids in class, what are they doing? They're working on the online work, just like the kids at home are working on the online work, right? But you also just have the luxury of relationship building, community building, the chance to connect with each other interpersonally in a face-to-face, in-person setting, and so on, right? But the work itself is all the online work. It's the same online work that the students at home are also doing. And that's one way to really reduce the burden on yourself as an educator, because you're not trying to figure out, oh, we're going to do this one thing in the classroom, we're going to do this other thing up in the cloud, right? Is that everything's in the cloud. All the learning work is in the cloud. And if you're lucky enough to have kids in front of you, then do that for the social emotional stuff, do that for the relationship and community building stuff, do that for the checking in with kids, and tutoring stuff and so on. But the learning work is all here for everybody. And then you don't have to design for, double spaces. You're only designing for one.
Yeah. And that just seems, as you're talking, I'm sitting here going, duh. Like it makes so much sense. And now here I am. I think about my own mindsets of, I've been supporting teachers that never really thought of it that way. And I know that's going to be so helpful for the teachers that have been asked to do both, and I think that kind of feels like two jobs, or the educators that maybe have been able to do all online, but they have to connect and be on the same page with the teachers who are doing hybrid, if they all work collectively through that approach. And so maybe just to build off that a little bit, I know in other sessions that we've explored in this particular PD series, but I know just anything that people have probably shared or looked up, we know, we start thinking about online lesson development or project development, things that we hear over and over, which are important, but I think most people know these things. One, your video should be short, the 5 minute or less type of theory. We should have the quick check. We got to make sure we have engagement, think about how you use your live sessions. So we know some of those things, but I feel like still a lot of people are still trying to struggle to wrap their head around how do we create these meaningful experiences? How do we create this engagement online, knowing that we know we need to chunk it and layer and we know there's 742,000 tools out there that will quote unquote solve all the issues. What are your thoughts on that? Are there other things they should think about? Is there anything else to that equation? Not to make it more complicated, but I think it's we hear it, we see it, we talk about it, and it's still hard to do. I don't know how else to explain it, but maybe it's still hard to like make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple, I think, key resources for your educators. One is the work that's being done by Catlin Tucker right now. So if your folks are not familiar with Catlin's work, she's like the guru of blended and online learning. And she's very practical, right? Like, you go and you visit her blog and your website, and she has very, very practical tips about, how do you do station rotation, for example, in a blended or online setting. And so Catlin should be a fantastic resource in terms of some of the practical logistics of the day-to-day work for your educators. And then the other one is Jennifer Gonzalez at Cult of Pedagogy, who also is trying to help people think through some of the practical implementation strategies and techniques that will be useful to teachers. And so between those two, your educators should get some pretty good tips and techniques that might be pretty useful to them. I think the other thing for me is that, again, under this idea of doing less, right, is that so much of what we do as teachers could be offloaded to students if we're willing to give up a little bit of control. And I think what this online or blended modality is forcing us to give up some control, right? Like, of necessity, we have to rely on our students as greater directors of their own learning than we had in the face-to-face classroom, right? So let's say, for example, that I used to be a social studies teacher in middle school, right? And so let's say that we're talking about, I don't know, the Revolutionary War. That's probably about the right time right now. It's October, right? With kids in American history, right? And so, ordinarily we might spend a couple weeks in some unit that I designed. We would read some stuff in the textbook or some other readings. We'd have viewings, websites, whatever, right? And then I would give them an assessment. But, there's lots of topics to explore the Revolutionary War. So maybe I'm still doing some of that work as a teacher, hitting some of the key things that I want them to hit. But I'm also assigning chunks of it out to kids, right? And either individually or small groups or pairs or whatever, right? So now it's not my job to teach the rest of the class about the battles of Lexington and Concord, just to pick something, right? It's actually your job, Aaron, with your partner, to learn everything you can about the battles of Lexington and Concord the next couple of days, and your job is to make a 3-minute explanatory video that will be shared with the rest of the class, right? And now all of a sudden, boom, I as a teacher don't have to do that work. You're doing that work instead with your partner, right, who's a classmate. And then what we're doing is we're getting student voice, we're getting student agency, we're getting student creativity. The students are owning the learning work. And then what I'm doing as a teacher is that when those resources come back in, right, and so I've got, 8 to, 12 different student projects, right, within the Revolutionary War, and collectively we're teaching each other about different aspects of what's happening. And then my job as a teacher is to fill in the few gaps that the students didn't cover, right? So maybe there's a couple of key things that I want students to know on your topic that you didn't hit in your video. Well, I can surely fill that in quite easily, right? But the students will probably get 80, 90% of it, right, on their own. And they'll have fun doing it, right? Because they get to own the work, they get to be creative around it, and so on. And I think this idea of divvying up the subject topic, right, in ways where the students can own a piece of it and I own a piece of it as the instructor, and we come together to teach each other and dialogue around it, is very different from me having to shove all of it at you as students, right? And I think these are the kinds of strategies that we definitely have to employ now while we're remote, but probably also should be doing when we're in class.
Yeah, and so if we run with that example, as that you're talking about that, it makes me think about, okay, so the kids are building some ownership. They're working on this material. Educators still have a requirement. I know it looks different from district to district, but these live sessions. One of the things that pops in, and we can call them office hours. Maybe it is a Q&A session, and not to get goofy on names, because I know there's also conversations like, let's rename office hours. Like, but the kids are going to
Right.
sniff out the bull in that anyways. My question is, kids have this ownership. What are your thoughts then with the live sessions? Is that, have you seen examples where that works, where it's wide open? I know my wife, when it was, I call the spring the emergency teaching versus, here we are in remote, working with small groups, and they could pick up for time slots. I think teachers are also trying to figure out what that looks like, because kids aren't utilizing those opportunities maybe as well as they should. Some of that is helping kids understand these new modalities of teaching and learning and what
Right.
that looks like. Do you still see a need for more of that live, for that kind of conversation, maybe more for direct instruction? What are your thoughts on then repurposing that? Because when we repurpose our original thoughts, where I'm going to do the direct instruction, here's all the things you're going to do, yada yada yada. Now I'm moving to student ownership. The domino effect in a good way now goes, well, now what do I do with this chunk of live time?
Right, absolutely. So lots of things to do with the lifetime. One, of course, is just relationship and community building. But I'm thinking about my son, who's a high school junior here, and he's taking civil engineering right now, right? And they're supposed to be building things and working on projects and working with design software and so on. And so, and they are an 80-minute time block. So teacher will use 10, 15 minutes to kind of get them launched for the day, right? And then, my son is working with his project partners on whatever their thing they're supposed to be building, right? And the teacher's just there, right? Just like you would be in class, right? Like in class, you would turn the kids loose in their small groups and they would work on stuff, right? And you're just kind of roaming around and watching, right? And the teacher can do the same thing, right? Like the teacher can turn the groups loose. They can say, all right, groups 1 and 2, I'm going to check in with you over the next 10 minutes. Groups 3 and 4, I'm checking with you over the following 10 minutes. By the way, we're going to have a whole class check-in. Everybody's going to report out on what your progress has been like over the last half hour. At this time, I'll see everybody back then, right? It's a great time to do individual conversations, tutoring check-ins, to do small group tutoring opportunities with the kids that need it. Like you just have all this flex with the lifetime. Like you don't have to do direct instruction for 60, 80 minutes or whatever your time is, right? Like just like you would in class, the kids are working and then you're just kind of popping in, checking in on people. You're having whole class check-ins. Everybody comes back together. Let's see where we are with things. Turn you loose again. Look, if you completely, don't use your right now in class, then you get to do it as homework, just like you would if we were meeting face to face, right? Like it's all the same stuff. I don't know why we have to think about this time as different. Um, just set it up.
Yeah, no, and I think, I mean, that's the key there, Scott. And I think, like anything in life, not just education, but in general, sometimes we tend to overcomplicate what doesn't need to be overcomplicated. We know we do that in education, just naturally. The whole system of education is, we know, overcomplicated. That's another conversation for another day. And I think that what you said though is spot on. Like, just take a pause, take a deep breath, and realize what you were doing doesn't have to be this super, 16 hours of planning what this live session could look like. Keep it authentic, just like you did in the classroom when you had them, in your 4-cylinder walls, confined to in between the bells of life, of school, where you did walk around and kids could come approach you and they could break out and have their small group conversations. And I think you can create the same thing, and you don't need 32 tools and 14 extensions and all these things to be successful. It's, here's this context, here's where I am at, go forth, come to me when needed, and do your check-in like you normally would. It just, as opposed to walking, we have to do some texting and maybe, using the voice and video. And so I think it's really important as a reminder just to go, what you need to do. And sometimes we're kind of sifting through the weeds. We didn't even need to get into the weeds to begin with.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that I think Catlin Tucker does so well. She articulates sort of how to think about that in a very structured, concrete way, right? Okay, look, so you've got this 60-minute block. Use 10 minutes as an introduction, use 10 minutes at the end for closing. That gives you 40 minutes in the middle. All right, great. Divide that 40 minutes into 4 chunks, right? And it's basically 4 rotations of kids, right? Every kid's going to have 2 of those blocks to work with their parents on, the work. 10-minute will be a conversation with the teacher in a small group, right? And then the other 10 minutes will be, whatever else, right? And that's the idea, right? Just segment it out and then just slot the times and turn kids loose and make sure everybody knows where they're supposed to be during the time block, and then say, see you later, see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right?
No, yeah, it's so good. I mean, yeah, we'll definitely make sure for those
Right.
that don't know her work to throw that into the resources for people. But yeah, I mean, I think it's so true.
Right. Yeah, and all the same things we would do in class, I think, are also possible in these online spaces, right? So you would send kids down to the library to get resources. Well, send kids to the web to get resources. You see a kid over here who's really struggling, but this kid on the other side of the room is doing well on that. So you would send kid B over to help kid A. We'll do the same thing online, right? Like you checked in on small group C, they're rocking it. Small group A is struggling. We'll get them connected, have them meet up and talk, right? Like put them in a breakout room, whatever. Like we can do the same kind of thing. We don't have, like you said, we don't have to overcomplicate it.
No, I love it. And I think as we're talking here and we kind of wrap up and get to the final thoughts, I know you've got a lot on your plate and we want to get the teachers into action. I think it's just coming back to this idea, almost what I talked about earlier. These 2 worlds don't need to be 2 worlds. It's one world, and it's just the platform is a little different, but our structures, our routines, our teaching patterns can be the same if you had good sound teaching practices to begin with, and I think that is the key to a lot of this. And so, Scott, as we kind of wrap this up here and move them into action, what are any kind of final thoughts you have? What are a challenge or talking points? I know I follow your blog, and I feel like every blog post always has something for us to stop and pause and reflect on. So I know you have lots of those, whether it's related to what we've talked about, it could be something completely different that maybe, we didn't cover in our 25 minutes together. But,
Sure.
what are some ideas or questions or things for educators to think about?
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything new. I would probably just summarize some of the key points of what we talked about,
Yeah.
which are take care of yourself first and foremost, all right? Let's give ourselves grace in the same way that we're trying to give our kids and families grace. Do less.
And that might be the hardest one to do, right there, to do less.
Right. One way to do that, of course, is by whittling down the curriculum into those essential pieces and go deeper on that. Designed for online, designed for high engagement, enlist students as partners. The more agency and control and ownership you're able to give kids, the less that you have to do, right? And then you're just filling in the gaps around whatever content or skills coverage you need to make happen, right? And tap into your online resources like Catlin Tucker and Jennifer Gonzalez and others, right, who are putting out some really great resources around strategies and logistics and, creative ideas to function during this environment. And most of all, we're all in this together, so lean on whoever you need to be successful. But, I think what you said about not overcomplicating it is a great way to probably end this conversation.
Yeah, and I think that, and I appreciate your insight and your perspective on all this, and even to go all the way back to something you said at the very beginning, that we didn't dive into, but I think is really important as we try to do less and we try to take care of ourselves. Working with your coaches, your administrators, whatever your other supports in your building, nobody has the answer, and I know that can be frustrating. But I also know, just due to the nature and the DNA of an educator, they also feel like they have to do all of the things. And when there isn't necessarily, I'm going to call it a direct order, and that sounds really negative. I don't mean a direct order, but when there isn't that strong decision-making leadership, because everybody's trying to figure this out. So this is not finger pointing in any capacity. You feel even more of a burden. Like, well, if they don't know, then I have to do this because it's my kid. And I think we have to continue to have those conversations with everybody involved, what does this look like? So something you said earlier, if the kids aren't showing up and doing any of the things, you need to make sure you're still pushing those conversations for admin to go, you guys need to do a visit, or what does this look like with our team and our collective effort? I just said, you go do this now. I just point a finger. I didn't, but having those conversations, because these are new roles, these are new scenarios. And so you're feeling that. Not everybody knows that you're feeling that either. So I think it's, just to kind of build into the recap of those things, also realize these conversations as a district, as a building, are just as important as the conversations you're having with yourself and with your students.
Absolutely.
So, well, Scott, thank you so much for your time. Great wisdom, great insights. We've got lots of things for people to go do and explore. And I think just to look at their structures, their routines, what they're doing, maybe think about what they should not be doing in order to strengthen what they should be doing. We'll definitely get the links to all the resources, how to reach out to you. All your stuff will be there, definitely in the show notes and the PD. And, as always, it's always a pleasure speaking with you, Scott. And thank you for taking some time to give us some new ideas to process.
Absolutely. Thanks, friend.